They didn't just find a coffin buried outside the cemetery, they found something inside it that should have been impossible. Something that changed the lives of everyone who was there that day, and honestly, something that still doesn't have a full explanation. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you is one of the most disturbing and genuinely unexplained burial mysteries ever documented. And by the time we get to the end, you're going to have chills you didn't ask for. Welcome to the Fear Sermon. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because we cover the kind of stories that mainstream channels won't touch. And if you've been here before, you already know that we don't do fake scares. Everything we bring to you is rooted in real events, real testimonies, and real history. Like this video if you're ready to go deep, because we're about to go very, very deep. Now let's set the scene. It's a small, rural town. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where the roads don't have names, just directions, where people still talk about things that happened 3 generations ago like they happened last Tuesday. This particular town sits in the American Midwest, and for the purposes of protecting the privacy of the families involved, we're going to keep the exact location vague. But the people who were there know exactly what we're talking about, and trust me, they have never forgotten. It started with a fence, a simple, weathered wooden fence that separated a stretch of private farmland from the edge of an old municipal cemetery. The cemetery itself had been in use since the mid-1800s. Generations of families buried there, rows of headstones that ranged from ornate Victorian monuments to simple flat markers barely readable after decades of rain and frost. A normal cemetery, a quiet place, the kind of place where nothing is supposed to happen because everything has already happened and everyone is already at rest. But just beyond the fence, on the farmland side, the ground had always been a little strange. The farmer who owned that land, a man who had worked those fields his entire adult life, had always noticed a particular patch near the fence line where nothing grew right. The soil there was darker, denser, and no matter what he planted, the yield was always poor. He'd never thought much of it. Old soil, he figured. Bad drainage, maybe. He had more important things to worry about. Seasons to manage. A family to feed. He left that patch alone for years. Then one spring, during a particularly wet season, the ground near the fence line began to shift. Not dramatically, not the kind of shift that makes headlines. Just a slow, subtle sinking, the way Earth sometimes settles over time. The farmer noticed it when he walked the fence to check for damage after a heavy storm. The ground near one section of the fence had dropped by several inches, creating a slight depression that collected water after every rain. He figured a tree root had rotted underground, maybe an old drainage pipe had collapsed. He called a local contractor to come take a look. The contractor brought a small excavation crew. 3 men with shovels, a handheld ground-penetrating radar unit they used for checking underground utility lines, and no expectations of finding anything unusual. They started digging at the lowest point of the depression, expecting to find a rotted root ball or a collapsed culvert. What the ground-penetrating radar showed them instead stopped every single one of them cold. There was a rectangular void approximately 6 feet below the surface. Roughly 6 feet long, roughly 2 feet wide, roughly 2 feet deep. The dimensions were unmistakable. Every single person on that crew had been around enough construction, enough utility work, enough general digging to know what a void that shape and size at that depth almost certainly meant. Nobody said it out loud at first, they just looked at each other. Then the contractor called the county. And then things got very complicated very quickly. The county sent out a deputy and a building inspector. The building inspector had a more sophisticated ground-penetrating radar unit. The results confirmed what the first scan had suggested. There was something down there, something with a defined shape, something that had been placed there deliberately. The deputy called the county coroner. The coroner called the state. And by the following morning, there was a full forensic excavation team on that farmland, on the wrong side of the cemetery fence. digging up something that nobody had any record of ever being buried there. What they found when they finally reached it was a wooden coffin, old, not ancient but genuinely old. The wood was dark and compressed from decades of soil pressure and moisture, but it had held together remarkably well. The style of the construction was consistent with burial practices from the early to mid-20th century, the kind of plain wooden box that was common in the 1920s and 1930s, particularly in rural communities where families often built their own coffins rather than purchasing them from a funeral home. There were no handles, no decorative elements, no metal hardware of any kind, just four walls, a base, and a lid, all held together with hand-cut wooden pegs rather than nails. And here is where the story takes a turn that nobody on that excavation team was prepared for. When the forensic team carefully removed the lid of that coffin, what they found inside was not a skeleton. It was not remains in any conventional sense. What they found was a person, or more precisely, what appeared to be a person in an extraordinary state of preservation. A body that should have been nothing but bones and dust after decades underground, but was instead remarkably intact. Skin still present, features still visible, hands folded across the chest, eyes closed as if simply asleep. The forensic team stopped everything. This was no longer a historical burial anomaly. This was a potential crime scene, an active investigation, and one of the most unsettling things any of them had ever encountered professionally. The coroner documented everything. Photographs were taken. The coffin and its contents were transported under seal to the state forensic laboratory. And the farmer, the contractor, the deputy, the building inspector, all of them were asked to give formal statements and to say nothing publicly while the investigation was ongoing. Of course, in a small town, the word still got out. It always does. Now, before we go further, I want to address something that I know some of you are already thinking. Preservation of a body underground is not completely unheard of. There are documented cases of what scientists call saponification, where body fat transforms into a soap-like substance called adipocere, which can preserve soft tissue for decades under the right conditions. Cold temperatures, low oxygen, particular soil chemistry, all of these factors can slow decomposition dramatically. So in purely scientific terms, a preserved body is not automatically supernatural. But what made this case so deeply unusual, what made this the kind of story that ends up here on the Fear Sermon years later, was not just the preservation. It was everything else they found inside that coffin. Beneath the body, pressed flat against the base of the coffin, were documents. Handwritten pages, multiple pages in a tight, careful script. The paper had survived remarkably well, protected from moisture by the body itself, acting almost like a seal. The forensic document examiners were eventually able to read most of what was written there. And what those pages contained was, depending on your perspective, either a deeply sad human story or something considerably more disturbing. The documents appeared to be a combination of a personal account, a kind of confessional narrative, and what could only be described as a set of instructions. The handwriting analysis suggested a single author. The language and phrasing was consistent with someone writing in the 1930s, possibly during or just after the Great Depression. The content described a person who had, according to their own words, chosen to be buried outside the cemetery deliberately and specifically. Not because they had been excluded, not because they had been denied a proper burial, but because they did not want to be where the others were. They did not want to be found easily, and they believed, according to these documents, that they would not stay buried. Read that again, slowly. They believed they would not stay buried. The documents went into considerable detail about this belief. The writer described a series of experiences over the course of their life that had convinced them that something about their body, their particular physical existence, was different from other people. They described waking from what they called deep sleeps, states that others had mistaken for death on at least 2 prior occasions. They described a family history of similar experiences going back generations. They described a genuine fear that if they were buried in the cemetery, among others, someone would eventually notice what was happening and would be frightened, or worse, would try to intervene in a process that the writer believed was natural, inevitable, and ultimately beyond human control. So they had made arrangements. The documents described those arrangements in careful detail. A trusted person, never named, had agreed to bury them in the spot beyond the fence if they died in a way that appeared natural and final. That trusted person was to check on the burial at specific intervals. The instructions outlined what to do if certain things were observed. And the final pages of the document, the most heavily worn and most difficult to read, contained what appeared to be a direct address to whoever eventually opened the coffin. The forensic team read that address. The investigator who led the forensic examination of the documents gave a statement years later, after the official investigation had been closed and the records had been made partially public under a Freedom of Information request. In that statement, she said, and I want to be careful to paraphrase accurately here because the exact wording of that address has never been officially released. She said that the final pages of document expressed something she had never encountered in any other document in her career. It was not a threat. It was not a warning in any traditional sense. It was, in her words, an expression of absolute certainty. The writer was certain they would be found. They were certain of the circumstances under which they would be found. And they expressed what she described as almost a calm acknowledgement of what would be discovered, as though the writer had known, decades before it happened, the approximate conditions under which that coffin would be opened. Let that settle for a moment. Now here is where the official investigation becomes frustrating for those of us trying to piece the full story together. Because at a certain point the case was reclassified. The records were sealed beyond what the Freedom of Information request could access, and the people directly involved became significantly less willing to speak publicly. The coroner who first attended the scene gave one brief interview to a regional newspaper before declining all further comment. The lead forensic investigator gave her statement years later, but refused to elaborate beyond what she had already said. The contractor who found the coffin moved out of the county within a year of the discovery and has not given any public statement. What we do know from the partial public record is this: the body in the coffin was confirmed to be genuinely old, consistent with the 1930s time frame suggested by the documents. DNA analysis was conducted, but the results, if they exist in any completed form, have not been released. The documents were authenticated as genuine by two independent forensic document examiners. The cause of death, if death was even the right word for the condition of the person in the coffin, was listed in the preliminary report as undetermined. And the final disposition of the remains has never been publicly announced. That last part is what gets me every time I come back to this case. We don't know where those remains are now. We don't know if they were buried again. We don't know if they were transferred to a research institution. We don't know what happened to the documents beyond the partial descriptions provided by the investigators who read them. It's as if the entire situation was quietly absorbed into a bureaucratic process designed specifically to make things disappear without explanation. But here's the thing about things that are made to disappear. The people who witnessed them don't disappear. The farmer who owned that land gave one interview years later to an independent researcher who was compiling documented cases of anomalous burial findings in the American Midwest. In that interview, the farmer said something that has stayed with me since I first read the transcript. He said that after the forensic team had removed the coffin and everything in it, after the excavation had been filled back in, after the investigators had gone and the contractor had packed up and the deputy had driven away, he went back to that spot along the fence line. He stood there for a long time, he said. And then he said that the ground had looked different, not in an obvious way, not in a way he could explain clearly or that he expected anyone to believe. Just different, like the way a room looks different after someone has left it, even if nothing in the room has physically changed. He sold the land the following year. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. Now I want to take a step back for a moment and talk about the broader context of this kind of discovery, because this is not, as strange as it seems, a completely isolated incident. Burial outside of consecrated or official cemetery grounds has a long and genuinely complex history in many cultures. In parts of early America, people who died by suicide were sometimes denied burial in church cemeteries and were buried at crossroads or at the edges of town. People who were considered social outcasts, criminals, the deeply poor, those who died in circumstances their communities found shameful, were often buried informally, without records, in places that made official sense at the time but have since been built over, farmed over, or simply forgotten. In the American South and Midwest particularly, there are numerous documented cases of what historians call shadow cemeteries, informal burial sites that existed alongside official ones, used by communities that were excluded from, or simply chose to exist apart from mainstream burial practices. Some of these sites are being rediscovered today through the same kind of ground-penetrating radar technology that found our coffin. Most of what is found in those sites is exactly what you would expect: bones, artifacts, historical records sometimes. Tragedy, often, but occasionally investigators find something that doesn't fit the expected pattern. Something that raises questions the official record is not equipped to answer. Something like a coffin buried on the wrong side of a fence, containing something that should not still be there, accompanied by documents written by someone who seemed to know they would be found long after they were gone. There is a specific thread within paranormal research and within certain historical and anthropological communities that focuses on what are sometimes called preserved anomalies. Cases where bodies have been found in states of preservation that defy easy scientific explanation, not necessarily because saponification or environmental factors couldn't theoretically account for them, but because the totality of the circumstances surrounding them suggests something more deliberate, more intentional than simple geological luck. The person in our case, if the documents are taken at face value, was not simply someone whose body happened to be preserved by favorable soil conditions. They were someone who expected that preservation, who planned around it, who left instructions for whoever came after, as if they were leaving directions for a caretaker rather than a posthumous note. That distinction matters, and it's the distinction that keeps researchers who study these cases up at night. Let me tell you about a few other cases that exist in that same strange space, because context matters, and because these cases collectively paint a picture that I think deserves your attention. In the 1980s, during the renovation of an old farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, workers discovered a sealed room beneath the cellar floor. Inside the room, which appeared to have been constructed deliberately and with considerable care, was a single wooden chair, a small table, and a cot. On the cot were the preserved remains of a person, wrapped in cloth, with a handwritten note pinned to the outside of the wrapping. The note, according to the workers who found it and the local historian who later documented the case, contained a date, a name, and a single sentence that translated roughly from an older dialect of German as "I am waiting for the right time to leave." The case was investigated by local authorities. The remains were removed. The note was kept as evidence. The official conclusion was that the room was a historical artifact of the farmhouse's original occupants, possibly related to religious practices, possibly related to fear of premature burial, which was a documented and widespread anxiety in the 18th and 19th centuries, and that conclusion is reasonable. It makes sense. It fits within a framework that is comfortable and explainable. But the workers who found that room, several of whom were interviewed by the local historian in the years following, consistently reported the same detail in their accounts, a detail that didn't make it into the official report. They said that when the cloth wrapping was removed from the remains, the position of the body had changed from the position in which it had been photographed when the room was first opened. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be considered definitive proof of anything, but enough that every single one of them noticed it. Enough that none of them ever discussed it with the press because they didn't want to sound like they were crazy. Enough that one of them, a man who had worked in construction for over 30 years and had never before expressed any interest in the paranormal, told the historian quietly, near the end of his life, that he thought about that room every single day. There is a case from the late 1990s in rural Georgia that follows a similar pattern. A family clearing land for a new house foundation discovered 3 coffins buried in a triangular arrangement, each pointing toward the center. The coffins were old, consistent with late 19th century construction. 2 of them contained remains in the expected state, skeletal and fragmentary after decades underground. The 3rd coffin was different. The 3rd coffin appeared to have been opened and resealed at some point after its original burial. The wood along the seam of the lid showed tool marks consistent with a pry bar or chisel, applied from the outside. The remains inside were partially disturbed, shifted from their original resting position, and tucked into the corner of the coffin, in a position that suggested it had been placed there after the original burial, was a small cloth bundle containing dried herbs, a piece of mirror glass, and a handwritten note. The note was brief. It said in plain English, "She came back twice. We are trying to help her rest. Do not open this again." The family who found those coffins contacted a local historical society. The historical society contacted the university. The university sent a team. The official report described the triangular burial arrangement as consistent with certain folk magic traditions practiced in the American South during the post-Reconstruction era, traditions that often involved burying individuals who were believed to be at risk of becoming what those traditions called restless, in specific configurations designed to prevent that restlessness from manifesting in harmful ways. The herbs and mirror glass were consistent with protective practices documented in those same traditions. The note was authenticated as genuine and consistent with a late 19th or early 20th century writing hand. The official report did not speculate about what the note meant. It documented what was found and placed it in historical context. That is what official reports do. They don't ask the follow-up question. They don't ask what the people who buried that 3rd coffin actually witnessed. They don't ask what twice meant specifically. They don't ask whether whatever they were trying to help rest was in fact rested. Those questions live in the spaces between the official record. And those spaces are exactly where the fear sermon exists. Because here is the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing that connects these cases and that connects them to our original story about the coffin found outside the cemetery fence. In each of these cases, the person or people who arranged the burial were not acting out of ignorance or superstition in a purely dismissive sense. They were responding to something specific they had witnessed. They were doing what they believed needed to be done. They left records or instructions or warnings, precisely because they expected someone would eventually come after them and would need to understand what they were dealing with. That level of intentionality deserves to be taken seriously, even if the conclusions those people reached about what they had witnessed don't map neatly onto any scientific framework we currently have. History is full of people who observed real phenomena and explained them in the language available to them, language that later generations dismissed as superstition until better tools came along and revealed that something genuinely anomalous had in fact been occurring. The history of medicine is largely a history of that process. The history of geology, the history of astronomy. In each case, there were people who knew something was real long before the dominant culture was willing to acknowledge it. I'm not telling you that the person in the coffin outside the cemetery was supernatural. I'm not telling you that the woman in the Georgian coffin literally came back from the dead. I'm not telling you that the person waiting in the sealed room in Pennsylvania was something other than a human being in an extreme state of physical and perhaps psychological distress. I am telling you that the people who encountered these situations clearly observed something, and that the official record in each case stops just short of telling us what that something actually was And I think you deserve to know that the stopping point is deliberate. It's not accidental. When investigators are told to reclassify a case, when records are sealed beyond what Freedom of Information requests can reach, when the final disposition of remains is simply never publicly announced, those are choices. Those are institutional decisions made by people who saw the full picture and decided that the full picture was not something that should be widely shared. I'm not saying that decision is always wrong. Sometimes it protects families, sometimes it protects the integrity of ongoing investigations. But sometimes I think it protects something else entirely, something that those institutions would prefer not to have to explain to the general public. Let me come back to our main story one more time, because there is one final detail I haven't shared yet. A detail that came from the independent researcher who interviewed the farmer. A detail that the farmer mentioned almost in passing, as if he wasn't sure it was relevant, as if he had spent years telling himself it wasn't relevant and had almost convinced himself. He said that the night after the forensic team left with the coffin, he couldn't sleep. He got up sometime after midnight and stood at the window of his farmhouse, which looked out over the field toward the fence line. It was a clear night. He could see the fence clearly in the moonlight. He could see the spot where the coffin had been removed, the filled-in excavation still slightly raised above the surrounding ground. And he said that there was a shape near the fence, not moving, just standing, just present. He described it as the shape of a person, standing very still, facing the spot where the coffin had been. He watched it for several minutes. It didn't move. He told himself it was a deer, or a fence post he had somehow misremembered, or a shadow cast at a strange angle by the tree line. He told himself all of those things. And then he went back to bed. In the morning, he went out to the fence line. The ground, near the excavation site, showed no footprints. The frost from overnight was completely undisturbed across the entire area. Whatever he had seen or thought he had seen had left no evidence of being there. He sold the land the following year, as I mentioned. The new owners built a new fence farther back from the cemetery, leaving a wider buffer zone between their property and the burial ground. When the independent researcher asked them why they had moved the fence, they said they just felt better with a little more distance. They couldn't explain it beyond that. They just felt better with a little more distance. There is something profoundly human about that response. We build distance between ourselves and the things that unsettle us. We reclassify cases. We seal records. We sell land and move fences and tell ourselves it was a deer or a shadow, or just the way the mind plays tricks in the middle of the night when you're tired and scared and standing alone at a window looking out at a field where something impossible might have just happened. We do all of that because the alternative is to sit with the uncertainty. And sitting with genuine uncertainty, the kind that doesn't resolve, the kind that the official record isn't equipped to address, is one of the most deeply uncomfortable things a human being can do. It requires you to acknowledge that there are things happening, have always been happening, that exist entirely outside the frameworks we use to make sense of the world. That the map is not the territory, that the things buried outside the boundaries, literally and figuratively, are not necessarily gone simply because we cannot see them from where we're standing. The person in that coffin left documents, they left instructions, they wrote a direct address to whoever would eventually open that lid. They did all of that because they wanted to be understood, or at least acknowledged. They wanted someone, someday, to sit with what they had experienced and not immediately reach for the comfortable explanation. They wanted someone to ask the follow-up question. I don't know their name. I don't know exactly where they are now, whether that's in a state forensic storage facility or reburied somewhere, or somewhere else entirely that doesn't fit into either of those categories. I don't know what the final pages of those documents actually said, because that information has never been publicly released. I don't know what the lead forensic investigator meant specifically when she described those pages as an expression of absolute certainty about being found, about the circumstances, about what would be discovered, but I know that the farmer saw something at his fence line at midnight. I know that the frost was undisturbed in the morning. I know that multiple people, in multiple official capacities, encountered this case and then went very quiet about it afterward. And I know that the ground in that particular spot near the fence never grew anything right, for years and years before anyone knew why. Some places know things, some soil holds memory in ways that science hasn't fully mapped yet. And some people, some rare and extraordinary people across the course of human history, have existed at the edges of what the rest of us understand to be possible. Not as monsters, not as villains, not as cautionary tales. Just as people whose experience of being alive, and of whatever comes after, didn't follow the expected pattern. That person in the coffin outside the cemetery fence was one of them. And somewhere in a sealed official file that you and I will probably never be allowed to read, the complete story of what they left behind is sitting in a folder, in a drawer, in a building that looks completely ordinary from the outside, and that, if you ask me, is the most frightening part of all of this. Not the preserved body, not the shape of the fence line, not even the documents with their expression of absolute certainty. The most frightening part is that someone read those final pages and decided the rest of us shouldn't know what they said. We here at the Fear Sermon are going to keep pulling on those threads. We are going to keep finding the cases that fall outside the official narrative, the stories that get quietly absorbed and sealed and moved to drawers in ordinary-looking buildings. Because these stories deserve to be told. The people in them deserve to be acknowledged. And you deserve to know that the map of what is possible is considerably larger and stranger and more interesting than the version most of us were given. If this story got under your skin, the way it got under mine, I want you to do 3 things right now. First, drop a comment below and tell me what part of this case unsettled you the most. Was it the documents, the preservation, the shape at the fence line, the sealed records? Tell me, because your instincts matter, and because the comments on this channel are genuinely some of the best conversations happening on the internet about this kind of material. Second, share this video with someone you know who is not afraid of the questions that don't have clean answers. Not everyone can handle this kind of thing, but the ones who can, they need to find each other, and this is a good place to start. And third, if you are not yet subscribed to the Fear Sermon, now is the time. We are just getting started with this kind of deep archival investigative storytelling, and the cases we have lined up for the coming weeks are going to make this one look like a war-map. The coffin is closed, the records are sealed, the frost was undisturbed in the morning, but the story, as it always does, found its way out. It found its way here, and now it belongs to all of us. Stay curious, stay brave, and whatever you do, pay attention to the patches of ground where nothing grows quite right. We'll talk soon.